Hello, what's up everyone? Welcome to the fourth and final part of this tutorial on how to learn how to develop on learning how to develop iOS apps with Xcode, Swift and SwiftUI when you are a total beginner. So what have we learned in the past three videos? So in the past three videos, I've used this tutorial, so develop in Swift made by Apple. You have the link in the description of the video. And we've covered the basics of how Xcode works. So Xcode, the software that you use when you want to create apps for any kind of device in the Apple ecosystem. Then we saw the basics of how views, structs, and properties could be used together to design simple but yet interesting views. So we did a simple weather app, and we saw that with this concept of putting together stuff inside views and subviews, we could reuse, and so we could build increasingly more complex systems. Then we covered layout and style with the basic of how to layout and style a SwiftUI view, so how to position elements precisely where you want them on the screen and how to style them. And by style, we mean things like color, font. It's mainly color and font, actually. I'm trying to think of a third one, but what could be style? Yeah, color, font. Is there a third thing that comes to mind when you talk about style? I'm not sure actually. If you have an ID and you're watching live, let me know in the chat. But yeah, style, it's mostly color and font. Arguably, size could also be part of the style, even though it's also part of the layout. But style and layout are very interlinked together. Then in the previous chapter, so we covered buttons and state. So we saw how we could put in our UI. Oh, a great example. Yes, adding border and strokes. Yes, we covered that. And of course, I have already forgotten about it. But yes, so adding a border or a stroke or any kind of I don't know how you say it in English, but in French you would say like dressing up the text. I'm sure there is a word for it, but it's basically like everything that you put around the text. It can be also things like putting the first letter super big, this kind of stuff. But yeah, also like in styling, it can be things around text like we didn't cover it, but the space between characters or the space between each line also that can be customized. Actually, we saw how to make a font monospaced, for instance. So that was also a great example of how to style text to fit a specific context. Yes, outline would also be a great example. And so, previous chapter, so buttons and state, we saw how to lay out special UI components called buttons that the user could interact with. And when the user would interact with these buttons, it would change the state of the app, and then the UI would update itself in order to reflect the new state of the app. And today we're going to cover the last chapter of the tutorial, so called lists and text fields. And we're going to see how to create a dynamic interface in which user can enter data. Before, user could enter data, but in a very limited way. They could like add a dice or remove one, and they could draw the dice. So that was data entry, but you couldn't enter arbitrary data. When you have a text field, you can enter text and you can enter arbitrary text. And we'll see how you build such a UI. And we'll see that it's quite interesting because building such a UI actually needs you to be able to pass ownership of, or rather to not to transfer, but to give access, because you don't transfer the ownership, but you give access in reading and writing to a piece of data by a subview. And we didn't cover that up until now. So that will be the main focus of today. So let's get started. So we'll create dynamic content. We're going to use text field, list, and binding to create dynamic content. So this binding stuff, it's what I was mentioning, is the way to give a subview a read and write access to a parent view. So if you've ever typed on an iPhone, you've used a text field. And arguably, every single iOS app, not every single one, but almost every single iOS app uses text fields, whether it's to log in, to search, to set up any kind of form. At some point, you will need to have a text field, even if it's a game, to enter the player's name. It's almost like there is no escaping using a text field. So it's very important to understand how this component works, not only because it's like the poster child for a component that needs to read and access a state in read and write, because of course if you're writing a text field, you need to write the data somewhere, but also because it's the typical component of any iOS app. So in this tutorial, you'll build an app that lets someone enter a list of names and then select one at random by tapping a button. So we can see that this part, select one at random by tapping a button, is quite similar to what we did in the previous chapter. So we can see that we are building on the knowledge that we've acquired just before. And that's one of the reasons why I think this tutorial from Apple is really nice, because it like introduces concepts incrementally and it builds on what was introduced in the previous chapter. So this way it makes it, I think, very easy to keep everything fresh in mind and not forget things as you are learning newer things. Let me make myself a little bit smaller because I don't want to hide the code, because the code is way more important. All right. So first we'll create a list. So list is a common SwiftUI container view that displays data in a single column. Unlike stacks, lists scroll vertically, so you don't need to worry about having more data than will fit on the screen. This makes lists ideal when you don't know the length of a data set or when the length can change. So length can change, dynamic content, we can see a pattern here. So let's get started. We're going to create a new iOS app in Xcode. So by now, I think we're pretty familiar with how to do it. So it's going to be called Pick a Pal. So I'm in Xcode. So creating an iOS app, I'm calling it Pick a Pal. Guess I keep SwiftUI and Swift, but let's just make sure. Yeah, they don't go over it, but we'll keep SwiftUI and Swift and uncheck include tests, because I don't think we're going to be writing tests. Okay, the project has been saved on my desktop and I have my boilerplate right here. I'm just gonna wait for the preview to start just so that I can make sure that it works correctly. You know, if there is a problem, much better to solve it right at the beginning. And of course, the preview always takes a bit of time to launch the first time. All right, it's gonna come. It's just about being patient. All right, we have the preview working. So let's go back to the tutorial. So they say that we should replace the content of the VStack with a static list of names. And a list view adds other views to the content in its body, like separator between rows and visual elements, such as rounded corners and backgrounds. So it's very important what they're saying here, is that the list, it adds, and you can see it here, and you will see it again when I will paste the code. The list, it displays the text, so the 4 pieces of text here, but it also adds style to these text views, because it doesn't just display the text on top of each other like a VStack would. It adds this inset rounded rectangle, it adds this gray background, and it adds these gray separators. So interestingly, you can see that they make us put the list inside the VStack and not instead of the VStack. So that's on purpose. I guess they want to draw our attention to the fact that here the list is indeed inside the VStack, because we can see the padding of the VStack on the side. But I guess they will get to it, maybe to make it more explicit. So then, to be able to add and remove names using the app, start by removing your text views from the list. Then add a state property called names to store an array of string values. Add a few names to the array. So actually we're taking these values right here and we are putting them into this array. And let me make it over several lines so that we can see how it looks like. All right. And they say an array can contain values of any type, but all the items in the array need to be the same type. That's absolutely true. Step 4, use a for each view to create a dynamic list. Type the code manually. For each has code completion options for many different uses. So I've said it before and I say it again, I will copy paste because it's much simpler for me and it avoids me losing time on just writing code. But if you're following along or doing the tutorial yourself, please take time to write it down yourself, because when you're learning the thing, when you're learning the material, writing it really helps memorize and appropriate, get familiar with the knowledge. So don't follow my example of copy and pasting like I'm doing right here. So you can see that we're putting a for each inside of the list. And maybe they will explain why we do this. So first, they talk about the for each. They say that for each, so the for each view uses a closure with a parameter to represent each value from the dataset you give it. You might read the syntax as the syntax name, as in a name value coming into the closure. So this is the closure, and the idea is that the for each view will call the closure for each value inside the array and will pass each value as the argument of the closure. So here the closure will be called 4 times, and the first time it will receive the string Elisha in the name argument, second time Andre, third time Yasmin, and third time Pochun. So that's the logic of iterating. And you can see that it's basically the equivalent of a for loop, but in the SwiftUI realm. And they say, click and drag in the preview to see how the list uses standard iOS scrolling behavior, even when it's shorter than the height of the screen. So indeed, if we scroll, we can see that the scroll does happen and it bounces, meaning that we can scroll past the end, past the border of the parent view, and as soon as we let go, it goes back into place. Okay, section 2, use a text field to enter names. So we're getting into the meat of the topic. So a text field view lets people enter text in a box. The text field modifies a string value in your app's state. When people tap return, you can use a closure to add the name they entered to the list. So step 1 will create a new state property to store the name that will be added to the list. So this new property right here. So name to add. So we can see this pattern of adding a property to store the data that is currently being created. We saw it before. Actually, I'm not sure if we saw it. No, I think we saw it actually just after this. The tutorial goes into how to use Swift data, but I've already covered this in a series of tutorials, and I think that's where I saw this pattern. It was in the Swift data part. So if you haven't seen this pattern before, it's normal. Forget what I've just said. I don't think it's been covered in this section like of the tutorial, the one about getting started, but it comes in the next part about Swift data, which I've already covered. And if you want to check it out, it's available on my YouTube channel. So rather than explicitly declaring the properties type with name to add :string, you can rely on type inference when you assign it a default value. Because so the empty string, so quote quote with nothing in between, is a string value, Swift infers the type of name to add to be string. So very important, this syntax doesn't mean that name to add doesn't have a type or that it's like any possible type. It does have a type, it's of type string. Simply, we don't have to spell it out, so we don't have to write it like this, because since the default value here is of type string, the compiler can infer this property to be also of type string. But a good way to see that it does indeed have a type is to alt-click on it, and when you alt-click, you can see that indeed it's of type string. So the type is defined. We just don't need to write it explicitly, but it's there. And if we try to set something else to the property later on, like an int, for instance, we would get a compilation error. Step 2, we create a text field beneath the list and pass it a binding to the name to add property. When someone types into the text field, it changes the value of name to add, and SwiftUI knows to update your view. SwiftUI knows to update the view because the view uses the property in the text field. So as I was saying, the text field is going to both read and write to this property, to the string. It reads it to know what to display, but then as soon as you type a new character, it writes the new character to the property, which in turn redraws the text field to display the updated string. So it's really this loop. It's the same loop that we've seen before on how the UI updates, but this time we see it happen in a way where it's the user typing with the keyboard that triggers the UI being updated. And here they explain what is a binding. So a binding is a way for you to give one view access to state that another view owns. That's very important. Earlier, when I started to say that a binding is a way to share ownership, it was a mistake because you're not really sharing ownership, you're giving access to state owned by a parent view. That's very important because there is the view that owns the data and there is the view that only has access to the data. And it's not the same thing, it's not the same responsibility. To create a binding to a state property, prefix the property name with $. And if it feels a bit magical, it kind of is. It's literally something that is hard-coded inside the compiler. When you prefix a property with @state or any other property wrapper for that matter with $, it calls something called the projected value, which is something that a property wrapper can implement. And so in the case of @state, it returns a binding. And I see a question which is it only because it's declared @state variable when is it only because it's @state variable being used as that property? What do you mean by is it only? I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean like is it like why the UI is being refreshed? I'm not sure what you mean. Or is it because or do you mean because when we add the $, you get a binding? Let me know which one it is, and then I will try to answer it. In the meantime, I'm going to add the text field to the code. So let me go back to Xcode. So I'm supposed to add it after the list, I think, after the list and still in the VStack. Okay. So yeah. So indeed, it's only going to update the UI because the property is marked as @state. Or rather, it's a bit more subtle than that, and I covered it in the previous chapter, but let me go over it again because it's very important. Up until iOS 17, the way observation worked in SwiftUI was that whenever an @state property would be updated, then the body of the corresponding view would be recomputed. This meant that an @state property to change was a necessary and sufficient condition for the body to be recomputed. With iOS 17, if you use iOS 17's new observation mechanism, this changes a bit because for the body to be recomputed, not only do you need the property to be @state, but you also need the property to be used inside the body. This means that @state is now only a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. For it to be sufficient, you also need to have the property be used in the body. This way, if a property is marked as @state but not used in the body, then the body will not be recomputed. And the idea is that at scale, it can have a benefit on performances. And if you're wondering why this was only introduced in iOS 17, it's because in iOS 17, when they built it, they had support for macros, and it's in a big part thanks to macros that this mechanism works. Because in order to be able to track when a property is used, you need to have a mechanism that's going to add calls to some kind of register that indeed the property has been used by the body. And for this, you need to add extra code that will run at runtime, and thanks to a macro, it can be generated. This extra code can be generated like automatically. That's why this was only introduced with iOS 17 and not before, because before the Swift language couldn't support it. If you're new to Swift, this must have sound very complex and cryptic. Don't be scared by it. It's more of an advanced topic, what a macro is. But I still wanted to mention it so that if you want to learn more, you have the pointers to know in which direction to look. Okay. So now let's move up. So yeah, before macros, you need to explicitly set up observers, and this would be a nightmare. And that's why SwiftUI, which has a goal of being simple and accessible, didn't go down that road. But yeah, what the macro does is that it sets up observers. It's the observer pattern that you might have learned from design patterns, or even if you use like a Java. Back in the days, Java had the observer pattern built in, so you might have also used it. And if you've used it, you probably know that it's a bit like cumbersome, and so you understand why they didn't make it work like that in SwiftUI until they were able to fully abstract this observation code away by generating it automatically. Because not only is like not amazing to write this kind of code, but it's also very, very error prone. It's kind of like managing memory manually in a way. Like a lot of room to make errors, and errors that can be frustrating to understand, debug. So good thing that they waited until the compiler could write this dull but error prone code for us. Okay. Then we're going to use the onSubmit modifier to add the entered name to the names array and reset the text field. Similar to a button, onSubmit uses a closure to run imperative code when someone taps return. So we can see that the text field has this behavior that is kind of similar to a button. The button, you would give it a closure, and it would be called when the button was pressed. Here, the text field, you need to give it a binding to a text because its main feature is to type text. But if you want to react to the return key being tapped, then you can pass a closure, and you do it through the modifier onSubmit. This also is a good opportunity for me to give once again an explanation of why some arguments are passed in the init and others are passed through modifiers, because you might be wondering, well, for the button I had to pass the closure through the init. Why is it not the case here? It's because for a button, the closure to be triggered when the button is tapped is part of the core feature of the button. Arguably, a button without a closure to call when the button is tapped has no purpose. So that's why it has to be provided in the init. Same thing for a text field. A text field with no binding to a string to read and write to makes no sense. That's why you pass this binding in the init. However, it makes total sense for a text field to not have any specific behavior for when the return key has been hit, because maybe you don't want to do anything in that case, and it makes total sense. That's why, since this is more of a secondary or an accessory use case, the closure is passed through a modifier. So remember, the bottom line is that arguments passed through the init are part of the core feature of the view, and without them, the view doesn't really make sense. And arguments that are more like optional to how the view behaves, yes, they are passed through modifiers. This way, it gives more flexibility, but it comes at the price that there is no guarantee that the modifier will be called. That's why inside the view, you need to deal with both code paths. Here, the text field probably needs to check whether or not a closure has been provided before calling it. So that's all for what I wanted to say. So let's copy and paste the closure. Before I just read this. So they say you use append to add a new value to an array. It's similar to the way you modify a view. So you can call append. You can also do plus equal. It also works, but under the hood, it also calls append. And here they say experiment, add more names to the list. Try pressing return when the text field is empty to see what happens. So let's try it. I'm also going to reformat the code like that. Okay, So I'm going to add my name first, and then I hit enter, and you can see my name was added. And then if I just hit enter, you can see that it adds an empty string to the list. So maybe we want to add some business logic in order to prevent this from happening. So let's see. Yeah, that's what's happening. So add an if statement to prevent empty strings from being added to the list. The if statement checks the condition not name to add is empty, so the same as name to add is empty equal false. If name to add contains an empty string, is empty will be true. Since you want to execute code when the string is not empty, use the exclamation mark or the not, or also called the not operator, to negate the meaning. So it's the same thing as doing equal false. If you read this code, you can read this code as if name to add is not empty. So let's do that. So let's select the code right here. Let's open a curly brace. This way it's automatically encapsulated inside of it. And then it's if not name to add is empty. Personally, I find it sometimes nicer to write it like that, equal false. The reason why is because when you write it like this, the exclamation mark, it can be easy to miss. Especially imagine if this variable were to start with like an L, for instance, it can be very easy to miss it. So personally, I prefer the equal false because when you look at the code at a glance, it's easier to spot an equal false than a leading exclamation mark. But this thing is mostly a matter of preferences. There is no like best practice here. Everyone has kind of like their own preference. What's the next step? To see how your app works with the iOS keyboard, choose Product Run to run your app in the simulator. It may take a few seconds for the simulator to boot and launch the app. So let's actually start the simulator while I keep reading here. And they say you may need to choose IO keyboard toggle software keyboard in the simulator to see the keyboard when you activate the text field. Yes, because by default, it's going to map the keyboard to the physical keyboard on my MacBook Pro. So it's taking time to boot the app. It always takes a bit of time the first time. And yeah, now it's still using the physical keyboard. So I'm going to go into the menu, IO. Sorry, it's outside of what you can see in the live stream. And I'm going to uncheck connect hardware keyboard. This way, now you can see that I get the keyboard of the iPhone. You can see that the text field was raised automatically. That's because the space available to the VStack was made smaller when the keyboard appeared. This might look like nothing, but in UIKit, there is nothing doing that for you in most cases. And so you have to deal with it manually. And it was always one of the pain points of using UIKit. And so now I can start writing, so using this keyboard. And if I hit enter, so it's in French, so it's in French, so it says retour, but it's return. And if I hit this key, you can see that the name is added and the text field has also dismissed the keyboard. That's the default behavior of the keyboard. I'm going to remove the stay on top for the simulator, otherwise it's gonna be amazing. Then they say something that's very interesting, but before I see a message in the chat, you're kidding me, you had to hard code for all the different screen sizes when the keyboard appears. Yeah, you had to do it. So actually, the way you would do it, at least the way I did it last time I had to do it, was you could listen to a notification that would tell you that the keyboard will appear or disappear, and you could get the height of the keyboard from that. But yes, in the very first iOS apps I worked on, the size of the keyboard was usually a constant in the project because it made things simpler. But then when the iPhone 5 was released, for instance, I think the size of the keyboard changed a bit, and so this code would break. So yeah, you had to listen to the keyboard appearing and disappearing, and then get the change in size from the notification you would get, and reduce like the size of your constraints accordingly. I think there were packages that were made in order to deal with this. I remember a package called like keyboard avoiding text field or keyboard avoiding layout. There were open source libraries that would deal with it, but yeah, UIKit didn't offer a built-in way to deal with avoiding the keyboard, which would make it quite hard to get started, because like the first time I tried to write a very simple iOS app, so more than 10 years ago, I got stuck on this because like the keyboard would cover the text field, and I was like, how do I do it? And it gets super complex, and you don't really know how to do it when you're like getting started. So that was a big pain point that SwiftUI managed to solve rather efficiently, to be honest. Okay, so they were saying one thing here, which is quite insightful, which is that autocorrection doesn't always recognize names correctly. So it makes sense to disable it for the Pickupal app. Turn off autocorrection for the text field by using a modifier. So let me show you what they mean. So here, if I start to write my name, so I need to type it here, you can see that it tries to autocorrect it, but it gives suggestions that don't make sense, but also it might want, if I have like if I try to write this one like po dot dash rather tune, okay, it gets it, but let's imagine that it's a name, like I don't know, I'm adding characters, but no, it doesn't try to autocorrect. But let's try to just write this. So you can see that here I wrote Chunny, and if I hit space, it autocorrected to chunky, because chunky is a word that's in the English dictionary, whereas like first names they might not be in the dictionary, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. So having autocorrect for such a text field that allows user to enter a name is not great, and so that's why we want to disable it. So I'm going to do autocorrection disabled, and I'm going to apply this modifier to the text field like that. And if I relaunch in the simulator, now you can see that autocorrection is so it's still writing down the suggestions, interestingly enough, but you can see that if I hit space, it's not autocorrecting. So you can see that disabling autocorrection is not the same as disabling the suggestions here. They are still here, but it won't autocorrect to one of them when it deems that there is a mistake in what you've written. And so they say that this modifier, so autocorrection disabled, is one of the many modifiers that alter the behavior and appearance of the keyboard. And if you're following the tutorial in a replay, definitely here make a pause and try to see what others there are, because it's very interesting to see how all the way that you can customize a component like a text field, which is actually quite versatile, because you can imagine, for instance, that maybe there is a modifier to say what kind of data are you typing, because if you're typing a number, a phone number, maybe we want to show you a different keyboard than if you're typing any kind of text. So that's really worth exploring these modifiers. So step 7, they tell us that Xcode pauses the preview when you run an app in the simulator. To reactivate it, click the arrow at the top of the preview canvas, so right here. You can keep the simulator open while you continue to work in Xcode, and tip: to hide the debug area that appears at the bottom of the project window when you run your app, choose View Debug Area, Hide Debug Area. Oh, that's interesting. So you can do it, but can you do it like always or not? No, it's like you need to re-hide it next time. Or I think you can also click on this button right here, which is like shorter when you don't know the keyboard shortcut by heart. All right, then picking a random element from an array. So add a button below the text field that picks a random name from the list. You'll display the pick name in a text view at the top of the app using a ternary conditional operator. So let's see. Step 1, add a new property to track the picked name. And you can see that we are also initializing it to the empty string. Step 2, add a text view above the list to display the picked name, or if there's no pick name, a single space. So this is where we're using this ternary. So ternary is this syntax which says if this condition is true, then use this value, otherwise use this other value. So it's kind of like an if statement, but with a different syntax. It's an if-else statement, but with a different syntax. And it's like an if-else statement, except that the if and the else can only contain a single expression that is returned. So it's a simplified version of the if-else statement. And here they say that by using a single space instead of an empty string, you ensure that the view always occupies vertical space on the screen. A text view takes up no space when it doesn't have any content, which causes other views on the screen to shift. So what we want is that even when there is no pick name to display, we still want the text to take the size it would take when there is a pick name to display. This way, when we display a pick name, the UI won't shift because the view has gone from being 0 height to being the actual height of a piece of text. Okay, so I need to add this above the list, so like that, so we can see the empty space, and we can see that if we use, you can see that when you use, so actually the empty space is here above the list. I was pointing at the wrong place, not here, above. And you can see that if I remove the white space and only give the empty string, then the text takes no occupies no space on the screen. You can see it because if I click on text, nothing appears. Unlike when I click on list, for instance, here nothing appears. But if I put the space back, then you can see that it's displayed here. And so we have the white space, but the white space also, as a consequence, gives its height to the text. And you might remember from a previous video that this is called the intrinsic height of the text. And when the text has no string to display, its intrinsic height and width are above 0. But as soon as it has a text, then from the text, it can derive the intrinsic width and height, and it's just a function of the text and the font used to display the text. So what's next? So they say, look at the ternary conditional operator. So maybe they will explain what I've explained just before in your code. So it has 3 parts. First, a Boolean condition, followed by a space and a question mark. Next, the value to use when the condition is true, followed by a colon. Last, the value to use when the condition is false. Ternary conditional operators are a compact way to represent a view that changes based on an either-or condition, since the logic is right there in the views modifiers, in the views or modifiers code. It's more concise than techniques like the compute properties in customized view with properties, which would have been to create a property that would do this computation under the hood, which are more readable but hide the logic. You can choose whichever style suits you. I would say choose whichever makes the code clearer. And actually, since the latest feature of Swift, I think I could also write it like that if I wanted. Let me try. I'm not sure if it's valid. I will need to do return like that. Okay, I tried doing it like that. If return, else return. But no, I mean, it doesn't work super well that way. And if I don't put, because you can write this in Swift now, it's valid. But since we are inside the body of a view, which is quite a special place in code, sorry, which is quite a special place in code because you can't use in the body you can't use all of the control flow statement that you can use in regular Swift code. For instance, you can't use a for loop. You have to use a for each. You can use an if, but you can only use it in special places, and that's why here you cannot use an if. Otherwise, what I wanted to show you was that today, thank you. Today in Swift, you can do something like it would be something like if bool dot random then 0 else 1, like this build successfully. This is valid. So you can use this syntax instead of a ternary if you prefer. I would argue that the ternary is more readable when it's so simple, but you cannot use this syntax here because you can't use if else inside the value that you pass to a view inside the body. Swift doesn't know how to handle it, but it's still possible in code that is not part of the body of a view. That's what I wanted to show you. Right. So next step. Now we add a button below the text field that picks this random element from the list. So the button code is there. So let's just copy and paste and then try to explain it. So what do we have? So in the closure that gets called when the button is tapped, if let random name equal names.random element, so a method to get a random element from an array, it returns an optional because the array could be empty. And so if there is a random name, then we set picked random name to it. Otherwise, we set picked random name to the empty string. And that can only happen when the array names is already empty. I see a question. So in line syntax with two sets of braces, is that like that still can have multiple statements per set of braces? Inline statements with two sets of braces like that still can have multiple statements. I think you could. But you would need to put a semicolon to explicitly separate the statements. But I think you can do it. I wouldn't recommend it because Swift doesn't require semicolons, and it's kind of a shame to bring them back. But as long as you provide Swift with a way to know where the first statement stops and the second one starts, and that's the goal of a semicolon, then you can do it. And you might see also the semicolon syntax when you do like a guard statement, and you want in the else of the guard, you want to do something before returning and still do it on one line. That's also a place where you can see a semicolon appear in Swift. But semicolons are extremely rare in Swift, and it's typically that's a typical use case when you want to put two statements on a single line of code. Okay, so they give a bit more explanation. So you use a random element with an array to get one of its elements at random. If the array is empty, you'll get the special value, Swift value nil, which indicates a non-value. The possibility of a non-value introduces a risk to your code. If let is a kind of if statement that lets you safely work with potentially nil values. So a nil value, it represents the absence of a value, and it's kind of the same than the concept of a null pointer that you can have in other languages. The difference is that Swift will force you to explicitly deal with the case where a value is nil. And if you want to force it by saying, no, I know that it's not nil, you can still do it. But of course, if it happens to be nil, then your app will crash at runtime. So in this case, if the condition is met, so the array returns a random name, you can use random name in the first block of code, so right here. If the condition is not met, so if the array returns nil, or rather the method or random element called on the array returns nil, then the code in the else block runs. And so step 5, add a divider to visually separate the text field and the button. And it says that a list automatically uses dividers to separate items. look at your list and notice the alignment between the start of the dividers and the start of the text. So let's put a divider. So it's between the text field and the button. So it's gonna go right here. So let's see. I need to resume the preview. You can see the divider. So it's quite small. I'm going to zoom in a bit so that you can see it on the live stream, but I need to be able to still be able to scroll. Okay, so you can see the divider like right here. It's the same than what's used here, except that as you can see here, the list, it aligns the left end of the divider, or rather the leading end of the divider, with the leading edge of the text, because it's more pleasing visually. But it's not a built-in behavior of divider, it's a behavior that is managed by the list. And you can see that when you use a divider, it just puts a list of a line of 1 pixel here horizontally. I'm not sure if you use a divider inside an H tag, if it puts a line vertically. It would make sense, but I don't remember having tested it. So actually, I'm not sure whether it would do it or not. Okay. So now I guess it's gonna be about testing. Actually, we should be able to test. If I click on pick random name, you can see that indeed it does work and it displays the random name at the top of the list. All right. Section 4 is use a toggle to customize the behavior. So we're going to give people the option to remove names after they're picked. To implement this feature, add a toggle for people to choose between the two behaviors. Toggles represent an on-off state, much like the text field to your toggle will modify the state of your view, so you'll need to add a new addState property. We're going to add a new Boolean state property to keep track of the name removal feature. So let me add this new addState property like that. So should remove picked name. Above the button, add a toggle with a binding to the new Boolean property. So above the button, we add this toggle. So we can see it looks like this, remove when picked, something that we are, so this kind of UI component we are super familiar with in iOS. We see it all the time. A typical example is in the settings app to enable or disable plane mode or enable or disable Wi-Fi. It's very ubiquitous inside iOS apps, and it's basically the equivalent of the checkbox that you can see on the web. It's equivalent in the iOS world. So toggles are similar to text fields. Both require a single binding. So a text field requires a binding to a string, and as you can imagine, a toggle requires a binding to a Boolean. And they say just after, because the toggle controls an on-off state, its binding is a Boolean. So if I make a few mistakes when reading, actually I'm realizing that I'm quite tired, and the reason is that I came back from California 2 days ago. So when we are at the end of the day, that's when I can still feel the jet lag still being a bit present, and I can see it like whenever like I struggle to say some word or I just like misread something. It's I can feel that I'm starting to get a bit tired right now, because if you add 9 hours, like it's almost 9 p.m. in France, so it would have been what, like 4 a.m. in California. So you understand why my body like feels a bit tired. Okay, next step, modify your buttons functionality to remove the pick name from the list if the toggle is on. So yeah, you were surprised I was live. To be sure, I wasn't sure I would do it, but I came back on Friday. I came back Friday afternoon, and I managed to go to bed like at the normal time on Friday. So like yesterday and the day before, I was still a bit tired, a bit like sick from the plane, like the famous like plane flu. But today is getting better, but it's at the end of the day that you can feel that you get tired. And yesterday it was even worse, because I was watching like a movie in the Vision Pro that I brought back from the US, and since the Vision Pro is very like isolating, you can fall asleep within a Vision Pro. I can tell you that, like you can fall asleep more easily than watching a TV actually. So that was quite an interesting experience, and a bit scary because imagine you fall asleep and like you just do something and then you break your Vision Pro. That would be like the most stupid way to break it. So it was also like a little bit like concerning, to be honest. Okay, so they say now modify your buttons functionality to remove the pick name from the list if the toggle is on. So it will pick a name at random and then remove it. So it will remove a name at random. And rather it will remove it and also display it at the top. So it will take a name out of the list and put it at the top, but remove it from the list. So let me add the code into the button. So the button is here. And so, okay, so it's in the if let, so it's in this part of the code. Let me also fix the indentation. So if should remove pick name, then names remove all name where name equal name. So it's a way to remove, so it's going to remove all of the instances of that name. So actually, if I enter the same name several times and it's picked only once, it will be removed at all the places. Which makes sense. You could also say you only want to remove the first time, the first occurrence. It's a matter of what's your business logic here. Both can be implemented and both can be correct depending on what you want. So let's see. You can see that for now it just picks a name, but if I start to enable the toggle, then indeed names are being taken out, and that's it. The list is empty and it's over. What does it say here on the additional information? So you use removal to run code in a closure for each of the elements in the array. This closure represents the element with the name parameter and returns the bool value to indicate whether the element should be removed. The expression name equal pick name produces the bool value that you return. And tip, remember you can eliminate the return keyword for simple expressions. I scroll to another part of the yes, I scrolled when I did like I didn't do like I wanted to do comment tab and I did comment like at and it did something else. So yes, you can remove return. Actually, you can write it just like that, and it should still build and work correctly. Let's try it. Yeah, still works. So the reason is that inside a closure, when a closure only has a single expression, you can omit the return keyword. And now this is true for any function in Swift, but it used to be true only for closures before Swift 5. And here, I don't really like what they say, because they say you can eliminate the return keyword for simple expressions. I don't like the fact that they say simple expressions, because simple is not precise enough. It's actually when you have a single expression. So this is a single expression. But simple, simple, you oppose it to complex. But you can have a complex expression that is still a single one. You could have here an expression with several ands and or. It would still be a single expression, and so you could still omit the return keyword. So here, I don't agree that they said simple expression. It should be a single expression that they should say, according to me, because this single expression can be as complex as you want. So it's not the best way to describe this feature of the language. To be honest, I'm nitpicking a bit, but also since I'm reading a tutorial already made, it's kind of like my added value to try and add some extra commentary on it. Otherwise, I really feel like I'm just like reading, copy and pasting, and basically doing a voiceover for this tutorial. Section 5, we're going to use a custom button label. So we'll customize the button's label by using a new initializer that takes two closures, one for the action and one for the label. I'm not sure whether we did that in the previous chapter. I think we did. Yeah, we did it when we, for instance, when we put like the plus and minus text, I think we did it, yeah, to use the to provide a custom label for the button. And if we did, remember that label, when it comes to a button, it doesn't mean the text of the button, but it means whatever view makes up the body of the button. So label is really, it's the same as saying the body of the button. It's not just text. It can be confusing because in many languages and frameworks, label can mean only text. Typically, if you use UIKit, you might remember UI label, which is the equivalent of text in SwiftUI. But in SwiftUI, when you talk about a label for a button, it actually means whatever view makes up the body of the button. So step 1, we're going to add a button style and font to make the button more prominent. So we add a button style, border prominent, and the font title 2. So to the button right here, like that. We can see it's now much bigger. In SwiftUI, maybe I made a mistake somewhere and I said UIKit or Swift instead of SwiftUI. I've probably said something wrong without realizing it. So thank you for correcting it. So what's next? Change the button to use a custom label. So the button will still take a first closure for the action, but then it will also take a second closure that will be the label, which is whatever makes up the body of the button. And they say you can use this technique to make a button out of any view. So any view, you can wrap it inside a button and then the user can tap on it and it triggers an action. And this initializer for button has 2 closures, one for the action and one for the label. The action closure contains imperative code, so what must be executed when the button is tapped, and the label closure contains declarative view code. Oh, could a label be an image in SwiftUI? Yeah. So in SwiftUI, it's even more complex because in SwiftUI, let me tell you why I say that it's even more complex. I'm just going to copy and paste this thing right here. And I'm going to go over it because label, honestly, they've used this wording for too many things. So here I remove this part right here and I add the second closure. So label like that. So when label is used in that sense, so a closure argument that returns the view passed to another view, it can be anything. It can be a text, but it could be a VStack, a very complex VStack, a combination of VStack and HStack. It can be anything. It can be any arbitrary view. Actually, you can see it that here. So let me command click. You can see that it says that it returns that the closure returns the label, and you can see what is label. It's a generic type that conforms to protocol view. So it can be any kind of view. That's the first use of label. But as it turns out, SwiftUI also has a built-in view called label, which is a shortcut to have a title and an image set side by side. So when you use this label view, then it's to display a text and an image. So that's why when you say, could a button label be an image? Yes. Here you can pass anything that you want, but you could also pass this label, which makes it very easy to have text and image together. But the important thing is that this label with a capital L doesn't mean the same thing than this label with a lowercase l. Here it can be any kind of view whatsoever, and here it's a shortcut to basically having an HStack with an image and the text. So this can be quite confusing when you're not used to it, and to be honest, probably a bit of a misnomer on the SwiftUI team's end. And yeah, and I think there might be even a third, I think there might even be a third meaning to label that I don't remember right now, but I know it's one of the. One day I want to do an article or a newsletter email about like the many meanings of label in SwiftUI because it can be confusing, and I think there is 3 of them. So I think there is one that I have forgotten. So if you can find it, feel free to mention it in the chat. But one day this will be an article on my website because it's good to know about it, and it's also good to know that this like label with a capital L does exist because it's not that very well known, and it can be quite useful in some situations. But let's go back to the tutorial. And I see some people are joining in the chat. Welcome everyone. So Then we add padding to give the label a little room. So we put some padding on the label and not on the button itself. The distinction is important because if you were to put the padding on the button, then let me show you. If I put the padding on the button, seemingly it does the same thing. Actually, no, it didn't do the same thing. Maybe I should more do it like that. Yeah. Okay, no, it's because we have the button style, and the button style doesn't put like the blue in the padding. But you can see that if you put the padding on the button, it added the padding, but after the content of the button, after the label of the button. That's because the button style, it's applied to the label and not the button itself. So you really want to make sure that you put the padding on the label and not on the button itself. It's actually a very common mistake in SwiftUI, and I actually have a video coming just about this topic coming in a few weeks, because it's a very easy mistake to make, and depending on how you write the code, you could have the button look the same in both situations, but here it's gonna work correctly, and if you tap on this extra area, it still taps the button. But with the other code, when the padding is applied on the button, if you were to tap on this area, the button wouldn't register the tap, so it can be very confusing for the user. Actually, yeah. So they were saying, okay. So they were saying exactly what I was showing. So because you added the padding to the text view in the closure, the button applies its style to the padded text label. An experiment, what I did, remove the padding inside the label and add it to the button and add it before the button style modifier to see how the layout changes. And so when you do that, the padding is applied to the button and not its label, and most of the time it's not what you want. Or rather, no, it could be what you want, but the thing is, if the padding is applied in the label, then the space occupied by the padding will be tappable, but if the label is applied to the button, then the space occupied by the padding will not be tappable by the user. So it really depends on whether or not you want that space to be interactive for the user. Section 6, improve your app design. So now that the app is functional, add your own colors and icons to make it unique, because this is not really good looking. This is a typical example of an app being designed by a developer rather than a designer. So first, add a title and an icon at the top of the view. So we add a VStack for that at the top of the view. So something like that. That's already a bit better. It gives it a bit of this of the Apple built-in iOS app already. Then apply the app's accent color to the icon. And for that we use the tint value in foreground style to apply a custom tint color to the views. Okay, so something like that. So now we have the tint color, so the same color than that of the button. Then we're going to use hierarchical rendering mode for the icon. And so SF symbols have several different rendering mode. Hierarchical symbol rendering mode alters the opacity of the symbol's component. So let's see how it looks like, but I guess it will make the other ones maybe less opaque. So yeah, full opacity, and then maybe like 0.5 and 0.25. So that's kind of interesting. Like last time, I think we saw how you can also give a different color to each of the elements inside an SF symbol. Now we see that we can also give them different opacities, so it kind of shows you all of the power, once again, of SF symbols, which are quite a powerful feature of SwiftUI. Some people really call it the hidden gem of SwiftUI, because SF symbol makes it possible for you to design a good-looking app without having any designer resources and skills, and that's a great job at lowering the barrier of entry to creating a simple but functioning and visually appealing iOS app. Next, we're going to update the style of the picked name. So font boldness and foreground style. So it's going to be here. And for that, we need to pick a name to see it appear. All right. Then we apply a rounded rectangle clip shape to the list. And they say developers often make lists that occupy the full screen of an app, in which case rounded corners aren't necessary. You embedded this list in a VStack with other views, so rounding the corners is a nice design touch. So saying clip shape and rounded rectangle, because right now you can see that it's just a square and it really shows you that you have a list embedded into something and it's not the most visually appealing thing. But just by rounding the corners, actually makes it feel a little bit more natural. And once again, I'm going to give an example of the Vision Pro, but that's because I've been using it so much. The apps on the Vision Pro, they also have the rounded corners in order to make the window feel more natural when it's floating inside your vision. Interestingly, when you do the cinema mode on the Apple TV app, then you no longer have the rounded corners. But it's the only case, and it's because in that case, it tries to emulate something from the real world that we know doesn't have rounded corners, typically a cinema screen. Or if it does have, or rather, if it does have rounded corners in real life, it's so small that at the distance where you're at, it almost looks like there is no rounding. All right, and finally, customize the accent color of the app like you did in design and interface. If you want to match the project screenshot, use these values, so red, green, and blue. So let's see if I can remember how to do it. I think I can remember how to do it. So the way you would do it would be to go into the asset catalog, add a color. So let me call it, I will call it like main color. Then I need to make room so that I don't cover it. So I want to have the same color whether it's light or dark. And then how do I pick the color? So it's here. So here it's 0.345. Remember that I need to change the point by a comma because my computer is in French. 0.337. So here 0.337 and 0.812. 0.812. Okay, so now I have my color, and if I remember correctly, the way I would go about using it would be to go on the content view, so like that, and then so on the VStack to inject, so to do something like environment, I think it's tint, no, or accent. Or maybe it's just, maybe you just call the tint and then you say main. Okay, so that worked. Maybe that wasn't the way they showed us last time, but at least it did the job of setting the main color I've created into the tint color. And then since all of the views that are lower in the view hierarchy read this tint color, basically they read the value that I've overridden with this modifier right here. Okay, step 7, use an empty array for the default value of names so your app is ready to be used by other people. So what do we do? So, oh yes, put an empty array so that people can start to like enter names and remove them as they go. Okay. All right, we finished. Let's do the last quiz of this tutorial. So like last time, check your understanding. 3 questions. First one, select the correct code for passing view state into a control. So first one here declares the asset property with a trailing dollar. Okay, I don't think that's the correct one. This one, no trailing dollar when declaring, but also no trailing dollar when passing a binding. And the third one, here, oh, there is also another one. Okay, they did all of the possibilities. But this one, no dollar when declaring the property, but a dollar when passing a binding on the property. And here, a dollar in each place. And of course, is this one the correct one? So the dollar, you use it on a property that is marked at state when you want to derive a binding from that property. So that's the correct one. And say indeed you use at state to represent the state of a view, then create a binding using the dollar sign. Next question. Select the ternary conditional operator that never results in a number greater than 100. So value greater than 100, value or 100. So something that does like some kind of like clamping. So basically the logic would be if value is greater than 100, then return 100, else return value. So this does the opposite. It returns the value if it's greater than 100. So this never returns a number less than 100. This one here seems pretty good. Oh no, because this one, no. This one, there is 2 columns. So this one here with this one with the correct syntax and the correct position. So if value is greater than 100, return 100, else return value. This one is incorrect. So if the value is greater than 100, the result is 100. The value after the question mark. Otherwise, the result is the original value. So it's a way also to implement a max, a way to implement the max function between 2 values. That's how you would implement it under the hood. And last question, select the code that performs an action when people tap return in a text field. So we have the onSubmit modifier. Here we have passing a closure on the init of the text field and passing the closure through the onEnter modifier. So it's onSubmit. So we saw that this is not the correct syntax. It could be, but it doesn't really make sense because like you don't always need to provide a closure for what happens when you hit enter on a text field. So it makes sense that you provide it only when needed through a modifier, and the name is onSubmit, not onEnter. I'm not sure for the logic, but basically, I mean, the logic is that first the return key has different name depending on countries. It's return in the US, but it's enter in French, or rather we call it entrée, but it's the same thing. And submit, I think it comes more from the web, I would say, because the idea of submitting a form is a wording that feels very much web-based. But I understand that they made that choice because submitting a form might not, I mean, what I want to say is that, yes, when you hit the return key, you submit a form, but that might not be the only way to submit a form. Maybe you can submit it, for instance, programmatically by an action happening. Maybe you have a button somewhere that you can tap and it also submits. You have an OK button and it also submits, for instance. So I think that's why they use the word onSubmit, which is a bit more generic, but kind of makes sense because it encompasses the broader reality. And what we want to know, what we want to do is trigger disclosure when the text field is submitted, regardless of how it was submitted. It could be by hitting the return key. It could be because something else happened. All right, let's read the wrap-up, and then we will be done with this tutorial to get started with iOS. So the wrap-up on lists and text field. So text entry and displaying a list of items are features of many apps, and virtually any app offers this kind of feature. When you combine these skills with managing a dynamic dataset, you can explore even more kind of apps. And a typical app that is actually a front for a set of web services, for a front for an API, that's what it does. It displays data, it allows the user to enter data, and it sends data back to the web service. But many iOS apps are like this, and so what we've seen is a key part of the logic of an iOS app. So let's reflect on the concept that we've learned. Bindings and state work together. You use @state to create private state for a view to modify in response to people's actions. And then you use bindings to hand direct control of a view state to its subview. So direct control is very important because it shows the fact that there is a direct link in the sense that the parent explicitly passed a binding on a specific property to the child, but also I would say direct and full control, because the child view can do what it wants with the binding. It can set a new value. So it's important to understand that the state is shared with the subview. So you hand a direct and complete control over a view state to its subview. Technically, there are still ways to prevent giving complete control. You could create your own custom binding where you would add maybe some validation steps before you write the changes. But this is a more advanced use case. Text field uses all three types of state management we've learned, because to set up a text field, you create a string state property in your view, so the first kind of state management. You pass the text field a binding to the property so it can modify the property as people type on the keyboard, so how to share state with a subview. And then through the unsubmit modifier, we can offer a closure to perform actions when someone taps return, so a way to react to an event happening. And that's indeed the three types of state management that we've learned. So what topics and skills have we covered? List views for unknown amounts of data, so what is also called handling dynamic content. Storing a variable set of data in an array. This one feels pretty, once you've understood how to store a single piece of data in an add-state property, storing an array in an add-state property is kind of like it comes in rather naturally, I would say. Using for each to create views corresponding to each element in an array. So using for each to iterate over a collection and then produce a view for each element in the collection. Text field for entering text. Bindings to share state across views and across parent and child views. And custom labels for buttons, and label being any kind of view that you want. If you want to continue practicing, so first there are ways that you could extend the app we've just written. So one issue with the current design is that you can enter the same name multiple times. And when that name is selected at random, both are removed. Both or all instances rather are removed. Move the logic in onSubmit to guarantee that each new entry is unique. Hint, you can use contains with arrays in much the same way you use remove all. So you want to test whether the array already contains the name before you add it into the array. Now the question is, what do you do if it already contains the name? Do you simply not add it but still clear the UI? Do you not clear the UI? Do you show an error to the user? That's up to you. You can try and implement this. Other possibility, you can modify your app to strip leading and trailing white space from names as they are entered using the method trimming characters in. Look at character set to find the right kind of value to pass as the argument. Stripping white space helps ensure a clean dataset in your app. This is very important because typically, especially when you copy paste, it's so easy to have a trailing white space or leading white space, and then it's going to be saved as part of the string and it's going to mess up how your app looks like, potentially even mess up the logic of your app, and you don't want this to happen. And last one, add save list and load list button to let people reuse the list of name. Hint, you'll need a new state property. And we're talking about storing locally in the memory. We're not talking about storing in a way that gets persisted across so we are not talking about a storage that is persisted across the launch of the app. If you want to learn about that, it's the next part of the tutorial, the one about Swift data, and I've already covered it in a set of video. And the way they suggest to do it here, save and load, it's similar to how the memory feature on a calculator would work, for instance. Question, how do you control against removing interspaces like doctor dot space so and so? That's a good question. So trimming characters, I think trimming characters only apply to leading and trailing characters. When you say trim, it refers to like the beginning or the end, not in the middle. Please check, but I think that's the case. Because otherwise, as you're correct, it would be way too dangerous because any kind of white space would be removed. But trimming, I think I'm 99% sure that it's only for the beginning or the end. But that's a very good point that you make. And then for a more complex challenge, if you want to challenge yourself, formatting an address label. So start a new Excel project named address label. Use @state properties and text fields to collect the different elements of an address, like city and country. Why not also name, street, zip code, phone number. Then display a complete formatted address at the top of the screen. Customize the font, sizing, and colors of the intake form and address. And for instance, for the zip code, try to display a numeric keypad instead of the regular keypad, which also allows you to enter digits, but it's less convenient than the numeric keypad. And if you want to learn more, so you can read about text fields and lists and tables in the Human Interface Guidelines. So it's about knowing how to display lists, tables, and text fields inside an iOS app so that it looks nice and that it looks at home on iOS. You can read about managing user interface state in the SwiftUI documentation for a good summary of view state management. So questions like when is the view updated in response to a change in data are probably answered in this part of the documentation. This app that we've implemented has only touched the surface of what's possible with lists. Complete the building lists and navigation tutorial to explore more complex data modeling, list rows, and navigation to a detailed screen from a list. This is part of the Swift data tutorial, which I've already covered, so you can already find it in my videos. Textfield has robust formatting tools, including a formatter specifically intended to help format names. You can find out more about formatting text by checking out the SwiftUI documentation on Textfield and Formatter. This could be very useful, as you were mentioning, if you want to format the name of a doctor, a name with a title. It could be either Mr., Mrs., it could be a doctor, professor, all of these kind of title. Having it be formatted nicely can be very useful, and apparently Textfield, along with Formatter, has a feature for that. And finally, you can continue exploring SwiftUI with Learning SwiftUI and check a Swift tour. So I don't know about these two things, so let me check. Oh yes, Learning SwiftUI, it's a great tutorial. Actually, I did it in a live stream in August 2022, so almost 2 years ago. So you can find it in my channel, but it's a really great tutorial, and it covers some topics that we've already seen, but some others. So if you want to go further, it can be very interesting because you will be reusing some things we've covered. So it will be a good way for you to validate that you've understood them quite well, and you will also learn newer things about the subtleties of UIs in SwiftUI. So I recommend this one. And a Swift tour, it's more about getting a tour of the language. So I won't cover this one. Maybe I will cover it someday in a live stream. But it's a document that goes over all of the feature of the Swift programming language. All right, and what's next? Now that you have a foundation in Swift and SwiftUI, begin prototyping some of your own app ideas. Download the App Design Workbook to get started prototyping an app from research all the way to user testing. So it seems that Apple has published what seems to be a methodology to create apps. Okay, so actually it's a Keynote slide deck. I'm opening it. I'm going to try and show it to you. Could be interesting. Okay, just need to make it a bit smaller so that it fits. Okay. So we have many apps, many slides, 126 to be exact, and seems to be like a full methodology over how you should go about when you want to design an app. So that's a very interesting resource. I didn't know that it existed, so I'm glad I've learned about it. Yeah, if you plan to create your own app, definitely read this, especially if you have no knowledge in software creation methodology, and even if you do, it's always good to see like the twist on the typical methodology that Apple has probably put inside this document. But that's a great read. I will try to read it at some point, maybe in the plane when I will be going to WWDC. Seems like the perfect read for a long plane trip. And so it goes all the way from research all the way to user testing. Okay. Sorry. And when you're ready, you can continue with the developing Swift tutorials to learn about data modeling. So the part about Swift data, which, as I've told you, I've already covered. All right. So I think we are done with this series of tutorial to learn the very basics of how to develop in iOS. Thank you. How to develop in iOS apps with Swift, SwiftUI, and Xcode when you're a complete beginner. So thank you if you've followed up until now, because it means that you've followed everything. I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. So this tutorial, when you say, was there any good food at Apple for you? What do you mean? Because last time when I went, I didn't go at Apple actually. I went for work, but I didn't go at Apple. But if the question is like, is there good food at Apple for people like me who cannot eat lactose? Last time I went to WWDC in 2019, it was the case, because basically you always have a vegan option, and the vegan option is fine for lactose intolerance. So I'm very lucky that, I mean, US companies, they are very good at asking for dietary restrictions, so that's not a problem. But since there is like vegan options almost everywhere these days, it makes things much more simple for me. So I'm always very happy about that. But I have a good memory of the food at WWDC. Like, it wasn't like amazing, but I mean, back then you had 6,000 people that had to grab food during a 1 hour or 1 hour and a half span. So you cannot bring like fancy food, but like it was like sandwiches and stuff. But it was very good, and honestly, like I've known way worse at such large events. So that was quite nice and quite efficient, because distributing food to 6,000 people is quite a logistical challenge. I can tell you that. Like I didn't saw it, but I was scared of thinking about the size of the waste disposal bins and the amount of waste that they had to get out of the event every day. But the size of the bins must be extremely scary to see, because 6,000 people produce a lot of waste during a single day. Okay, so outside of this topic that had nothing to do with the main topic, what was I saying? I was saying, yes, so it's the end of this tutorial. Thank you so much if you followed up until now. This series was recording during live stream, so once again, a big thank you to the people that watched the live streams. I saw people come again and again every week, so it's super nice to see that. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Thanks so much for the questions that you've asked, and thank you so much for the remark also that you've made. It really helped, I think, elevate the quality of these videos, because I didn't only follow the tutorial, but also I was able to answer your question and your remark, and it's very likely that people watching will have the same question as they go about it. What I'm gonna try to do is that I have the recordings of all of the live streams. I think I will try to stitch them together into a very long video. As long as you're under 12 hours, you can do it on YouTube. So I think I will put everything into like a mega video and put that on YouTube rather than the individual live stream replays. Just because when you have 5 live streams, the last 2 ones or the last 3 ones, they don't perform well in terms of views, and so they are less discoverable. So maybe a very, very long video will be more discoverable. So I'm going to try it. We'll see how it goes. Always good to experiment. And worst case, I will just like put back the individual replays. And I think I've said everything I wanted to say. I think now it's going to be time for me soon to go to bed, because starting to get tired. I'm still a bit jet lagged from the US, but I'm glad that I did this final chapter of this series of live stream. And next week, normally, we should start a new series of live stream. I have a pretty good idea about what we're going to do. I hope you're going to enjoy it. It's not going to be about following tutorials this time. It's going to be about something completely new. It's going to be about a clever approach to try and find inspiration from the code base of popular real-world iOS apps. So I'm quite excited to do this one next week. And I think on this little teasing, it's when I have to say thanks again for watching, and see you next time. Bye-bye.